Okay, Stalingrad, part two. We're about to get started on this one. Sorry for the slight delay. So, if you remember where we left off, I had just in part one, I had just introduced the two generals. We have Paulus of the German Sixth Army is obviously the German side, and Zhukov is the Russian side. So you have to. So yeah, we've spoken about the Luftwaffe really bombed the city, right? And it was just rubble, half-standing buildings. But the Russians use it to their advantage by using guerrilla warfare. Okay. This does take some time for them to get going on it, and the Germans really advance pretty quickly. It's one of those moments in history where they're so close, and then something happens, and we'll get into what actually happens. I'd like to say just about General Zhukov, the Russian general, he is well aware of Dunkirk and what happened there, and he knows that the Blitzkrieg is only effective when it goes very quickly. Okay. But also he remembers he wasn't there, but back at Dunkirk there was the French started penetrating the lines because the Germans were very overextended, and it really stalled and caused some problems. All right, so he knows the weaknesses of Blitzkrieg. But for this lesson, I'm going to include as much footage as I can because that's the best way to really understand it. But we'll get started here.
Okay, so the battle itself. Initially, the Germans dominate and infiltrate deep into the city. So that's the beginning of the Blitzkrieg. The Russians they did have time to prepare, but it's very challenging to go up against this Blitzkrieg, especially when they're full of energy and ready to go. As we've already discussed, the bombing of the city created a perfect environment for guerrilla urban warfare, which the Russians eventually excel at. This is essential to warfare in the 20th century, as the world can see how it's impossible to defeat an enemy that you cannot see. And we'll see that. So when I say that the Germans are doing very well initially, they are, but it's an incredibly violent sort of process, massive civilian deaths, a lot of casualties on the German front too, and it's just that urban warfare thing we were talking about. You're going building to building, room to room, that kind of thing. So the Soviet sharpshooters dominate their Nazi counterparts as they're familiar with the city and the weather. So news gets out of the success, or how the Russians were just so close to defeat, but they bounced back, and that word spreads, and it inspires everybody. Okay. Another thing, sorry, it looks like it's kind of cut off there, but Stalin reroutes an entire Serbian division that was stationed near Japan. Reason for this, these were very battle-hardened, tough guys from Serbia. He had them near Japan because he was worried that Japan would invade on that side. And he got word from one of his spies in Japan that they had no intention of doing so, which, I don't blame them. Like, that side of Russia, there's, like, nothing there. So then he reroutes them. They hop on their train and go across the entire country. And they are, like, more than welcome to help out in Stalingrad. Again, Zhukov, familiar with the vulnerabilities of Blitzkrieg, he orders something called Operation Uranus. And it changes the course of history, basically. So the weakness of Blitzkrieg being these people are very overextended.
The Soviet defenders used the sewers for shelter and communications, and the ruins above for sniping. Russian reinforcements had to be brought across the river. Often they were under assault from the air. But even so, thousands got through. By late September, the Germans had pushed their way through most of the city, almost to the Volga. For Hitler, the capture of Stalingrad was now an obsession. On October the 4th, 1942, General Paulus launched what was meant to be the final assault on Stalingrad. Tanks led the way, grinding over the rubble and firing point blank into courtyards. One German officer said, "The advance is measured in corpses, not meters." German victory seemed certain, but in fact, the Germans were dangerously overextended. By mid-November, the Soviet army was bringing in reinforcements. More than 1 million troops, 13,500 guns, 900 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft were secretly moved to the battle zone. On November the 19th, they attacked the Germans' northern flank. After a massive artillery barrage, the T-34s and assault infantry burst through the German positions. Now, it was the Germans who surrendered in their thousands. The next day, the Soviet assault in the south was equally successful. And on November the 23rd, these pincer movements met west of Stalingrad, cutting off the German Sixth Army.
Okay, so that encirclement is very important. That's the big one. The video didn't really go into the details that I would have liked, but all those troops and supplies were done at night, done very secretly on the Russian side. So they kind of baited the Germans. They kind of let them really go for it, and then they knew from the Battle of France, they're like, or from what happened, they knew you're going to be very overextended, and we're going to wait and wait and wait, and then when there's that perfect moment, we're going to pounce. And that's what they did. It was probably one of the most incredible encirclements in history. And it was the Germans had a serious problem at that point. And you're familiar with the term Lebensraum. Hitler became so obsessed and so sort of hurt by the retreat at Moscow that he didn't let Paulus get out of the encirclement. They easily could have done it. They could have just said, hey, let's back up a bit. We can break this encirclement early. But Hitler was like, nope, no step back. Or no, he didn't say no step back. He said, that was Stalin, but he refused to retreat. So the Germans are in trouble because they have their best the German Sixth Army, the top of the top, encircled. Now, when you're encircled, the big issue is you don't get supplies, okay? Now, if you remember from our earlier discussion about Goering, Goering is a very arrogant, boisterous, elitist sort of figure. He, in an attempt to score points with Hitler, says, "Oh, I'll get the Luftwaffe. Don't worry. We'll get the supplies into this cauldron, and they'll be fine." So it's a total failure. And basically, what happens is the German Sixth Army, basically, you can't fight when you don't have food or arms or weapons or whatever. So it's a slow death, and it's the ultimate defeat because Hitler refuses to let them break out. He does send Manstein, he gets him back in the game again to try and break that encirclement, but it just doesn't happen. So basically, the Germans are in a lot of trouble as it's just a matter of time. And the Soviet Union are well aware of all the atrocities that have gone on. They have them encircled, and they're just kind of sitting there licking their chops kind of thing. Like, it'd be a very harsh environment to be in, to be encircled by the German, or by the Russians at that point. One of the things I wanted to mention, Paulus, okay, if Guderian was in there, he probably would have broken out. Not to say that he would, it just wouldn't make sense to him. He's that much of an innovator and a leader. He would probably say, well, Hitler will thank me in a month. This is a hopeless situation. However, Paulus is what they call like a backroom star, kind of a pen pusher. I wouldn't say pen pusher, but he's pretty, he will not defy Hitler. He does exactly what he's told up until the very, very end. And this is, it's a very sad place to be if you're an officer like Paulus at this point, basically watching your troops starve to death. So I think there's about 120,000, maybe there's more than that, I have to check. There's a lot of troops in there, and it's a hopeless situation.
Paulus to attempt to break out of Stalingrad. But Paulus wanted Hitler's permission. This was refused. It was probably too late anyway. Marshal Zhukov now unleashed the next stage of his master plan. It was a massive assault on the Panzer Relief operation. The panzers were pushed back, away from the city, and by the end of December, all hope of relieving the German forces in Stalingrad had gone. Worse still, plans to airlift aid into the city were a fiasco. The German troops needed 700 tons of supplies a day to survive. They never received more than 80. The weather was too bad, and the Red Air Force now commanded the skies. Steadily, the Soviet troops squeezed in on the encircled Germans. 200,000 men were trapped. On January the 8th, the Soviets called on the Germans to surrender. They refused. January the 31st, 1943, Paulus was forced to surrender. Over 100,000 men stumbled off into captivity. Only 5,000 would ever return to Germany. Stalingrad had been a bloody battle. The Germans had been savaged. They had lost some 300,000 of their men and at least as many of their allies. The Russians had lost about the same number, including thousands of civilians. It was Germany's greatest catastrophe in the war so far, but it wouldn't be the last.
Okay, interesting tactic by Hitler. Said that they must fight and, if necessary, die till the last bullet. No surrendering. His tactic was he promoted Paulus to field marshal, which is the highest rank you can get, basically. And no field marshal had ever surrendered to. So that was a message basically saying you should commit suicide. Paulus refuses to do this, claiming religious reasons. And eventually he has to surrender on February 2nd, 1943. Okay, this is known as the beginning of the end for Hitler. So the victory inspires the nation of Russia, shows the world that's the big one, shows the world that the Germans can be defeated. They hadn't been defeated at all. It hadn't even been close. It had just been a mismatch up to this point. I mean, Battle of Britain, they sort of tried, that was kind of a different story, but as far as their army, they had been pretty untouchable up to this point. And then not just to lose, but to just be absolutely destroyed in this manner when they were what they thought they were so close a couple of times. And this is the start of what's called the Soviet steamroller, where yes, they beat them at Stalingrad, but they are going to go after the Germans in the coming months, and they just won't look back in coming months, in the next year and a half. And those are kind of some big themes. Okay, so the big keys here to the victory. Hitler underestimated the will of the Russian people. I'll get into that actually at my next little video after this slide. Guerrilla warfare is a key. Zhukov's willingness to adapt. That's huge. You know, if you're going to be successful in war, especially with like the technology, you have to be able to adapt. Now, you know, the French and the Brits didn't really know how to adapt, and that's what cost them the Battle of France. But once they experienced that, then they were like, okay. Now, Zhukov is trained very traditionally, but he's willing to use that kind of encirclement as, you know, it's a very new tactic for him. But he's very crafty and very sneaky in doing it. They had no idea it was happening, and it also hit where they were most vulnerable. So they not only played to their strengths, they played to the Germans' weaknesses, because they weren't even where they encircled them. They weren't even German troops. They were Hungarian, Romanian, and that's where they were most vulnerable. So there was Hitler's total refusal to adapt. I mean, you can just see. I'm at a loss for words. How do you explain that? How do you come back from that? Just letting your best infantry units just starve to death because it's all about your ego and this so-called Lebensraum thing that, okay. But a big thing, incredible loss of troops and resources. I mean, to this day, there's parts around the city where you can dig and there's bodies. Like, they're still there. It was just like a totally barbaric conflict. Another thing, no oil from the Caucasus. Remember, that was the big thing? He was like, I need that oil. That obviously never happened. Okay? And even if it... I mean, the oil thing is a good argument. As like, if you're at war, you need oil. But any kind of oil was refineries or whatever was totally torched by the time the Nazis got there in other parts of the Soviet Union. So, you know, it would have taken years to get that back up and going, but that's what it all came down to. So I guess that you call that a fail on the attempt to get oil.
I forgot to say, I'm all about relevance. Now, what's relevant for this battle to you? You might say absolutely nothing, but there is a lot there. This is going sort of into the social, emotional learning, but you don't. He's like, oh, thanks, Mr. Gall. Don't be like Hitler. Like, you really needed your degrees for that. Don't be like Hitler, yes, for lots of different reasons, but especially, I mean, realistically, we've all had people we know people that can't swallow their pride, or they can't be like, oh, I messed up, or that was me, or I didn't mean to do that, or they can't own up to things. Sometimes you're gonna lose, in life. You fail at things, but as we see with Churchill, he was able to get them back and fight another day. And you never want to be stuck in the cauldron. So that's my little metaphor for for life in taking something from Stalingrad. Okay. I'd like to talk a bit about Hitler totally underestimating the will of the Russian people. Now, he underestimates the will of the people in Britain too. He thinks like, oh, I'll destroy morale by bombing cities and stuff, and the opposite occurs. And that's the same thing that happens in Russia. But in Russia, it's much more barbaric. When word gets out of the kind of atrocities that the Nazis have done throughout the Soviet Union, it really makes people mad, okay? And there's something about the Russians. They are incredibly tough. Now, in Stalingrad, you have to imagine like an almost apocalyptic kind of setting. And a lot of these people, the Russian soldiers that crossed the River Volga, initially, there's a famous scene in a movie about it where every second soldier is given a rifle. And it's like, okay, well, when the guy in front of you gets shot, you take his rifle and we'll each give you 2 bullets and just go. So there's not a huge respect for human life. But in a battle like this, where it's just you put it all on the line, the Russians they've been through some very awful times, okay? And they have Stalin as their leader. He's not exactly a pleasant guy to live under. But I just wanted to tell you this story I saw in a documentary was it was the Battle of Stalingrad. There was a reporter in the army or a photographer or something. He got lost and he ended up coming across this small village, or like this kind of peasant sort of house, a little hut in the country, because he had to flee or whatever. And he hadn't eaten in days. He's cold, he's tired, all that stuff. And this sweet sort of peasant lady brings him in, and she cleans him up, and she gives him some of the food, very little food that she has to. Anyway, while the two of them are talking, while she's cooking, she's like whistling, and the reporter, the guy, is just like, he's like, how are you in such good spirits with all this going on? And she had actually just told him that her husband was killed. She has 3 sons, and she knows 2 of them are dead, and there's only one, and he's just in awe that she's so kind of cheerful. And she's like, how do you keep this kind of keep these spirits up? And she says, very famous quote, she says, well, this morning I prayed to God, but only the devil arrived. And I told him 2 words I can't say, or 1 word I can't say. But this is a sweet old lady. And it just goes to show you the sheer determination of the Russian people. And they really came together in the Battle of Stalingrad. Now let's get into a little bit about the ridiculous decision that was Adolf Hitler to let the German Sixth Army just starve to death, basically. It's all about his ego. He has this obsession with Lebensraum. He's like, oh, we have that land, we don't want to let it go. It's like, all right, but they're going to starve to death. So he's incredibly unreasonable. And he's willing for these people to all die. It just doesn't add up, but it just goes into the same thing we talked about last lesson. He's the only successes the great success that the German forces had were because of their leadership. And he stripped the leaders, took command himself, and that was it. He was in trouble. Okay. Now, this is the big thing. You're going to have a few questions on this, and that's that. And now we're going to move on to our final project. Okay? Now, the reason I wanted to spend so much time on this battle is because I'm going to compare it just now. I'm going to give you some notes about it too. I'm going to compare Dunkirk and Stalingrad. 2 very different battles, but there's some similar themes in them. So if we go deeper, what we're comparing is the leaders. So we're comparing Churchill, okay, with Hitler. During the Battle of Dunkirk, we saw a bit on that video, if you remember, before Christmas, or was that before spring break, whatever. They're in trouble. Okay, they're just standing there. There's nothing to do. They can't fight, whatever. Now imagine if Churchill said, "No, you're gonna fight. Just fight to the last bullet, whatever." It would have made no sense. That's the same situation the German Sixth Army were in. Okay, now we've said before, Churchill was willing to admit defeat. He was like, "Hey, they got us. It's embarrassing, but the Navy can't physically get to Dunkirk. They can't get that close to get the troops. So I'll get the civilians to go get them. Whatever it takes, swallow my pride." And that's exactly what happens, right? This amazing evacuation, and they live to fight another day. And they and they do it later in D-Day, and things go very differently. Now, Hitler is not willing to swallow his pride. They're in trouble in this cauldron once they get surrounded, and he just lets them slowly perish, all because of his ego, because he cannot admit defeat, and he is a maniac, and his own people are paid the price, and that was just the beginning. So Stalingrad, in my opinion, the most important battle, I think, in history, because once people realized that the Blitzkrieg was vulnerable, okay, and they weren't this invincible force. Also, the drug use, in Stalingrad got really bad. People, these soldiers, they didn't have food, but they had those Pervitin pills. So imagine being in the like apocalyptic scene of Stalingrad, and these guys are popping these pills. They started seeing things that weren't there. Mental just breakdown. They started giving away their position or whatever, shooting at things that weren't there. And the Russians were just watching like, what is wrong with these guys? Snipers were watching, right? So it's like I said before, the beginning of the end of the invincible, apparent, like so-called invincible German armed forces in World War II. And I wanted to say one more thing. What was it? It's another thing, that guerrilla warfare thing. Whenever you're fighting people that are familiar with their area and you're not, you're at a huge disadvantage. Okay, this happened in the Boer War. And Churchill was actually fighting down there in South Africa in 1904. They thought that it'd be this pushover army, and they weren't at all, because the Boers knew the land. They knew every nook and cranny everywhere. They knew they were sharpshooters, and they weren't the pushover that they'd have expected. Okay, again, it happened in Vietnam. It happened in Ireland in the 1917 to 21 kind of thing. When you're fighting an enemy you can't see and that are familiar, very familiar with the land, you're in trouble. Okay, and that's exactly what happened at Stalingrad. Okay, we did it. Stalingrad's done. Now we can move on. Okay.